Depression, very common problem. And I think here are some of the symptoms. I won't read them off for you, but just look through those and you can kind of identify with some of those. You've probably felt depressed at some point or other. Very common. I mean, life can be depressing. Sometimes that's an appropriate response to life. It's just when it goes on, or there's nothing, it's out of proportion to what's going on, or it's inappropriate to what's going on, that it gets to be a symptom. For example, when you've had a great loss, like losing a death of a family member or a friend, a loved one, or a loss of a job or some type of loss, and you feel depressed, we call that grieving. So we distinguish between appropriate sort of depression and when it is appropriate. So we're talking about when it's inappropriate and it gets out of balance again, it gets out of proportion to what's going on. And these are some of the symptoms. Note there's quite a few physical symptoms going on there as well, and there's reasons for that. Edgar Cayce talked about depression in many, many readings. And I like this quote because it connects Edgar Cayce to the modern psychiatric version of depression in terms of what's going on. He said, "Impulse and brain forces are of two natures, the white and gray matter. One an impulse, the other the active force that carries on same. In the body we have that of the activity without the impulse to carry same forward. Hence we have what is commonly known or called melancholia or depression, or the inability to carry out the impulses of the body." Now, the reason I think that's so significant is that that's the model that's now used to explain depression by and large. It's a biochemical model. It's saying that depression is a problem in the nervous system, that there's a lapse of nerve impulse, and you need to understand this about the nervous system. We think of the nervous system as being sort of like electrical wiring with nerves, and there's electrical impulses. But that's true. There is a form of electricity that's carried through the nerves. But when one nerve goes to connect with another or to communicate with another, there's a gap in there, and it's called a synapse. It's like a channel between the nerves. And actually what happens is that one nerve sort of squirts a chemical onto the other across this synapse, and that's how it tells the impulse to carry through. So the next nerve will pick that up and then carry the impulse through the system. So in case he's talking about impulse and activity, those are key words. You'll find those over and over in the readings, and he'll connect those with the gray matter and the white matter. One an impulse, the other the activity to carry it out. And so in depression, we've got this lapse of nerve impulse, and maybe there's some kind of chemical process going on here that would account for that, and maybe drugs like Prozac or some of these other drugs, they work in that nerve channel, that synapse, so that they facilitate more of that chemical perhaps going through there or maybe staying longer in the synapse so it will have its effect. That's the model, the current model for treating depression. And here Edgar Cayce is using a similar kind of model to describe depression many, many years before that. And so this idea of the impulse and the activity, sometimes in depression you can have an impulse, you're lying in bed, you know you need to get out of bed, but yet you just can't make it happen. It doesn't carry forward, so you end up laying in bed for hours. Or you know you need to do this or to do that. You know it, and you have this impulse, but it doesn't carry through, you see. That's what he's describing. And the technical term for that process is called neurotransmission. Those are neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers that go across the synapse. And in the Edgar Cayce readings, he talked about lapses of impulse in many of those readings on depression. He talked about the nerve plasm, which we now call neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers. He talked about the nerve channels and the infinitesimal feelers associated with these nerve channels, these infinitesimal feelers that are sent out to connect the nerves. And what he's describing is what you would see now with an electron microscope when you look at nerves. But he didn't have an electron microscope. He just had his consciousness. But somehow he was able to go within, and even at a cellular level, to describe this process of what was going on. Isn't that fascinating? That's the sort of thing. When I find that in the readings, and I find it in modern science, see, it makes the readings come more real to me. And I see this over and over and over in the Cayce readings, where modern science has validated what Cayce is saying. Now, what is it that can produce this lapse of impulse that Cayce said is melancholia or depression? There are many things that can produce it. physical, mental, and spiritual. At a physical level, one of the most common was toxicity. And here's a case where he said, he was asked, what causes me to feel so sad and depressed, and how may I overcome same? The answer, the poisons that are the accumulations in the system. These work upon the nerve forces through those branches, as has been indicated in the sympathetic nerve force. In another reading, question, how may I overcome my periods of despondency? Are they due to physical or mental or environmental conditions? What a lovely question. This person is really tuned in to a multidimensional model, weren't they? Holistic model. The answer, physical and the effects of the poisons that will be cleansed by the cleansing of the colon when the other applications are made, purifying and removing toxins. And in this particular pattern of depression, what he said happens is that these toxins that can accumulate in the system from the colon or from other places in the body actually sort of seep in, he would use that term, sort of seep into this nerve, in the nerve cells, and sort of deaden this impulse. As the impulse is carried through, it will deaden the impulse, whether in the nerve or maybe in the synapse, who knows exactly where it is, but the toxicity actually causes that lapse of nerve impulse. So cleansing the system, internal cleansing, and this is one of the traditional models for treating depression in the spas of Europe and so forth, with hydrotherapy, colonic irrigations, steam baths, diet, anything that will help clean up the system, will help the nervous system and this impulse to carry through better. Very practical. At a mental level, one of the most common things that could cause this lapse of nerve impulse was self-condemnation. We get down on ourselves, and the self-condemnation has produced in those periods of the cerebral spinal system such activity upon the nervous system as to produce a reaction that is contrary to the activities of the nervous body. Hence those periods of melancholia, those periods when there is the determination for self-effacement in one manner or another. In other words, to condemn self, to put self down, self-effacement. Get down on yourself. And that happens a lot, doesn't it? In depression, sometimes you get down on yourself, and it sort of spirals down. The more you get down on yourself, the worse the depression gets.